Carlton King, the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
So welcome to part 2 of the Black Spy podcast's last week's recordings. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back to last week and have a listen. But this is part 2.
I'm going to slightly pivot the conversation a little bit with another question to Mum. Just circling back to students.
Yeah.
Radio 1 Newsbeat identified some student worries at the moment, which are debt and the cost of living crisis, AI replacing their future job prospects, teacher strikes, and I read a really harrowing article, which I will share. It was published in The Independent, and there were a few university students who were essentially saying that they're more worried about their housing debt than their coursework. Then, if you look at the next generation, the biggest worries at the moment are inflation and mortgage hikes and obviously constant cost of living. How is this played out when, I mean, Mum, you talked about Brompton Bikes, which obviously sounds like a really positive, feel-good business story. But do you talk to students about business failures?
Oh, yeah, very much so. So this is what I was saying, is that there is a lot of emphasis on Britain being rubbish.
Rubbish in what way? Tell the listeners more. We're keen to know what key messages the teaching community is passing on, because we all left school a long time ago.
Yeah. No, there is the productivity thing, which you can look at. There is the fact that the national debt is over 100% of our GDP, and we're the 5th or 6th largest economy, depending on how you measure GDP. So national debt is way beyond what we're ever going to be able to repay. So if we were an African country or any smaller country, we would basically, nobody would lend us any more money, period, right. And they wouldn't have a long time ago. Now, it is true that the Japanese national debt is higher than this, but the thing about Japan is that the Japanese government borrows from its own people. Okay, whereas
plus it's a 4.3 trillion GDP rather than a 2.8 trillion GDP.
In terms of Japan, you mean?
Yeah. Japan's GDP is twice ours.
Absolutely.
Nigh on.
But their national debt is over 2.5. I think it's now 2.5 times their GDP. Mm-hmm. So measure national debt as a percentage of your GDP. So that's what students are left with, is this notion that there is no more money. Okay.
Right.
Can't just keep on printing money. So last time, after 2008, Mervyn King, who was then Governor General of the Bank of England, said, I've got a clever idea. Let's print money and let's give it this crazy name that nobody's ever heard of before, called QE, quantitative easing. Mervyn King's idea Okay, so even though the Americans did it, the European Central Bank did it, some of the Eastern banks did it, but it was Mervyn King's idea to say, oh, let's see if we can get away with this. Well, every economist in the country said you increase the money supply, you get inflation. Inflation didn't happen, and Mervyn King got to the end of his tenure, you know, and then you have the next one, and now we're left with poor old Andrew Bailey, you know, who's a bit of the who's struggling in the job, and he's sort of going, I wonder whether the current rate of inflation has anything to do with way back in 2008-9, we just increased the money supply. And they increased the money supply by 60%, not just keep on printing more money. Even if you call it something else, if you call it electronic money, well, for heaven's sake, everything we buy these days is electronic money. It is exactly the same as, you know, corrupt governments, you know, Zimbabwe, Brazil, the Nazi Germany, all sorts of people. They learned the lesson that if you keep printing money, you get inflation. Britain printed money, and hey presto, inflation was delayed for a number of reasons, but now we've got inflation.
But I think maybe one of the problems was with that, and please explain and bring me on the right track, was that if you are a primary country, then who's calling your debt in? That's where the problem lies. Who calls your debt in? You mentioned before, if you're an African country, your debt's going to be called in as soon as you get to 75%. Bang. We want to know what the score is. But if you're a primary country, so the United States is a prime example of that, spending way beyond its means. Actually, to bring it into the bigger geopolitical realm, this is why Gaddafi was murdered. This is why Libya was attacked, because Gaddafi came out with the idea and spoke too loudly about it, of bringing back the gold dinar. Right. And that then would have undermined the whole of the monetary system. Yeah. Because, you know, as you know, Gordon Brown sold off a lot of our gold. We don't know how much gold the United States has. I do know because I saw with my own eyes during the Iraq War when they actually took Saddam's palace in the beginning. I actually went down into the vaults and I saw the gold piled up there in the vaults. Now, some of that obviously went to the United States. They probably took that with them. So they do have some, we know that. But the reality is, places like Libya, Saudi, UAE, who were going to run with them, they had gold en masse. To some extent, even South Africa had some gold knocking about. So the reality is they could afford to say, let's do this new standard, which is the old standard, of course, back to the gold standard. So they taught your man Gaddafi a lesson. Mm-hmm. And then very few people want to follow that lesson thereafter.
So in answer to your question, who are the critical elements if your national debt goes too high? And we go back to the credit rating agencies, Standard & Poor and those kind of people. Now, those are the very same people who were criticised for being corrupt in 2008.
And still are, because if you remember, 3 years back, 2 or 3 of them were called out in the US for being corrupt because they were setting the standards that were advantageous to the US.
Indeed so. And no one's in prison. So none, they all went through various courts and were asked, come on, how could you possibly have given these bonds a rating, for example, when you junk bonds? And the credit rating agencies just said, well, it's in our opinion. So they put in a little line that said, in our opinion. Well, our opinion happened to be different from what historically turned out.
Correct. And one of the interesting things is there's a great documentary on it. And they asked Greenspan the question, what about the derivatives? What about the algorithms that function to make to suggest that these were not junk bonds, that they were AAA, etc., etc. And in the end, he actually said, I don't have a clue.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is incredible. I don't have a clue. You're the man running the Treasury.
Indeed so. And where this affects, coming back to the present, I don't know whether interest rates are going to go up again today, or whether they have already gone up. But you've got all these people with mortgages who are just going, ouch, this is beyond ouch, the interest rates just jumping up. Now, of course, there is an argument, and, this would go on for another hour. There is an argument to say that the trouble was that interest rates were too low.
Yeah.
And they need to rectify. But that doesn't alter the fact that you had a whole load of people who were totally corrupt, who've made millions, etc., billions, etc., that we don't even know who they are.
Can I just leave you, because I'm conscious of time, can I just leave you with one thing? And we must have you back on again, because this is superb. We haven't touched on a whole host of issues. But one thing that I did want to touch on was the period of American growth, when everybody said America was number one, which is obviously after the Second World War, through into the 60s, just tipping into the 70s before the oil crisis. The period of American growth, when America was by far the greatest, when they actually wrote the doctrines that basically said America has 6% of the world's energy, or uses 6% of the world's energy, and our foreign policy, the dollar's policy, our foreign policy is to keep that being the circumstance. So that's 60% of all the world's energy. So they want to be, if you will, the hegemony of the world, which they have become. Now, at that time, this is the point I want to make. At that time, people were paying, who were wealthy, 90% taxes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Same in Britain at that time. Britain was in fact a little bit more than 90% taxes. Now you're lucky if these wealthiest people pay 10%.
Yeah, indeed so. Indeed so. Yep.
How has this happened?
How's it happened? Well, exactly. It's happened. And I hate to say it, because I thought New Labour was fantastic. But a lot of it goes back to Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown is a really nice guy when it comes to global debt forgiveness. So he was behind, that whole around 2000, there was a whole thing of sustainability objectives for the globe, and debt forgiveness, complete write-offs for countries, and all of that was instigated by Gordon Brown. But when it came to internal politics, for some reason he just couldn't. He was wowed by the city. So was Tony Blair, but with Blair, we kind of expected it. With Gordon Brown, one had this feeling that he was a good guy, and as I said, in many respects, he was a good guy. He did have a sense of what it's like to be poor. He was Scots. He was, he had his feet much firmer on the ground. But goodness, he was overawed by the wowness of the city, and he gave in to lots and lots of things. And then, of course, unfortunately for him, during his tenure, the whole collapse happened. So 2008 was Gordon Brown's government, and he just loosened the purse strings big time. So the amount we splashed out after the financial crisis was much, much more than we've splashed out on COVID.
Yeah, completely. But look, if we are rounding this up, I would love Mum to just actually narrate the positives for any of the listeners who are considering, or who have children that are thinking about taking on business studies or economics A-level or educational choice. No, we've sort of damned it and pulled it to pieces, but it would be great to hear from Mum as a roundup about why this is a positive, how close to reality it actually is, and whilst this isn't necessarily a recruitment drive, I think it sounds to me from a media temperature check that there are a lot of 14, 15-year-olds at the moment who are just actually terrified about what their work life is actually going to look like.
I think we need to, and this is why I'm just jumping in, I think we need to give Eva more time. We can't do it now, but I think we need to give Eva more time, because I don't think Eva can round that out. We haven't touched on so many things looking at the future, which I think she can, and I hope that you agree, Eva, that you can basically expand upon in terms of the educational aspect of this whole premise, because we haven't looked upon the things like, example, the hunger of students to learn, because I think in Britain the hunger isn't the same. So I was in Kenya and I saw how hungry the people were to learn. I mean, absolutely hungry. And there's none of that I see in the United Kingdom. You spoke earlier on about making it easier, about these comfort breaks or whatever they were. I mean, this is incredible. If you're going to have exams, then do them that way. If you're not going to have exams, it's not a problem. I'm not saying exams are great. I'm just saying if you're going to have them, make them proper. Don't turn around and say, we'll give you a comfort break so people can sit down and in their mind's eye write out what they're going to say. This sounds ludicrous. So for me, there's a whole host of issues that we need to look at, which you cannot just sum up. You are fantastic.
So you're essentially asking for part two, aren't you, Carl?
Correct, I am. It is absolutely necessary.
Okay.
And I think we should be spreading this out to a wider people. I think everybody listening should pass this to the next parent, to the next grandparent. Even if they don't generally listen to the show, say, listen to the show. This is where we are in the United Kingdom. And to be fair, in the rest of the world, this is what we are doing. And this is probably where we need to make some changes, because people need to look to this future. And I think that we can come back to Eva to get that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm doing this with my students, and I think, this, as you say, this is a much longer conversation. But there are, it is a total mismatch that the Russell Group universities are demanding at least 3 A's at A level, and that's ridiculous. The exam boards are dumbing down, and don't let anyone tell me that we're back to normal, to pre-COVID levels, because we're not. And students feel they are failing if they don't get an A or an A star in a subject. Well, that's, if that's the bar, then it means the exam is rubbish. Then these poor kids get to universities where, they Russell Group, etc., and they find they've got 3 hours of tuition, of face-to-face tuition. This isn't just one-to-one. This is one lecturer to an exam hall, 3 hours a week, okay, for their money.
Eva, sorry, could you just explain for our overseas viewers that the Russell Group is Oxford, Cambridge, and just et cetera?
Yeah, so there are about 26 universities.
It's what you used to call red brick universities, Carson, in old money.
Ivy League
version.
Yeah, exactly. So the one where once you've got a degree, you're going to brag about where you got your degree.
Yeah, St Andrews, et cetera.
Yeah, so which is, if you're going to pay all that amount of money, and your debt goes up at 6% above inflation, which when inflation was 1% was bad enough, okay? This is another one. As I said, this is for another few hours, okay? It was when the Blair government brought in education. We want 50% of the population to have a degree, etc. Universities turned around and said, well, students are going to have to pay it. We started off at 3,000 per year, and lesser universities were encouraged to have a fee rating that was lower. Now, of course, every university wants the top whack. What the Blair government then did is said, where are we going to find the money so that it doesn't appear on our national debt? Okay, this is an accounting scam. They said the student is liable to repay their own debt. Well, who's going to lend them the money? The banks. Who is underwriting the loan? So if the student does nothing and doesn't repay, who's underwriting it? The government. So as far as the banks are concerned, this is a risk-free loan.
Yeah.
Okay. The banks then turned around and said, "Oh yeah, risk-free is one thing, but we're greedy pigs. We need to make an interest on it." And they then said, "Okay, you can charge inflation." That's not good enough to the banks. And then they went to 1.25% above inflation. Okay, now just think about it. Inflation is now sticking at 8.5, 8.7 or something, even 1.25 above that. And you don't need to be particularly numerate to work out this stuff is compound interest. Before you know it, you're paying over 10% compound interest. 10 years down the line, you owe, huge amounts, £500,000. Okay, so it's not just a matter of what your future earning potential is and how exciting a degree is. One does need to go back and say, are you going to have an exciting 3 years at university, meet loads of people, do lots of networking, etc., etc. But also you need to say what's the academic input that you're getting and what's the debt that you're going to be lumbered with at the end. So I think a lot of apprenticeship schemes are actually going to come into their own. Tony Blair's son is very much into T-levels. Now, T-levels are, T stands for technical, obviously. They're kind of like A-levels, but with a practical bias. So it's not like BTEC, which is an A-level that's dumbed down. T-levels are actually an A-level talked up. So lots of students are kind of, and this is relatively new. And as I said, it's Tony Blair's son who's very much into T-levels. Blair himself wasn't. As a solution where you actually are, it's much more practical training. So let's go back to IT or AI or something, a T-level degree in anything AI related will be much more useful than a normal academic one.
Okay. So listen, I'm going to round this up because I'm conscious of time, and we will do a follow up. And Carlton, this might be your new podcast mother-in-law.
Yeah,
it's looking that way, my friend.
So what I was going to say though is just circling back to what Mum said earlier, which is that students aren't that stupid, and they find the workarounds and they find all of that. And I know your listeners quite like it when I sort of reference popular culture, but there was a TV show about it, like in the last decade, called Skins. Right, and it was basically it was teenagers like in Bristol sort of doing like running rogue, right? And there was they made a penultimate series which they really probably shouldn't have done because it was just sort of taking the whole thing too far about when these teenagers sort of went into the life of work. So they'd left sixth form and then they kind of went into the life of work. And there was one episode where one of the characters went into trading, and she got herself a job as a researcher on a trading desk, and she worked out that if she was I'll be polite. I'll be sensitive about the word choice, but if she was consummating with somebody on the other side who was only the other side of Canary Wharf, what she was on the trading desk, he was on the research desk. Essentially, it was insider trading, but she was so junior that she got away with it for a very long time.
Yeah.
Right. So circling back to the fact that kids aren't that stupid, maybe this is a round off. Let's just ask the listeners some questions. My question would be, if you've got teenage kids of your own, what do you think their hopes and fears are about money?
Well, I mean, I think that's an ideal place to stop when we're looking at where we are, because I'm conscious that we could
it's
go on.
not, because you have to do yours.
Well, I mean, mine is dead simple. Mine is that people should, hopefully will, spread the podcast far and wide, because the next time we're on, what I want to ask Ava is, what is the use, as your as the person contacted you about it, what is the use in education in terms of knowing it yourself, rather than using it as a bridge from technology? So what I'm saying is, if I have all the technology in the world at my hand, generally on my phone, but I pay for all the apps I can get, whatever, and I can actually have all the info that I require, why should I learn it? Why?
Yeah, and before I let my mum round this up with her thoughts and you know what she would like listeners to take away from this, I just want to share a little anecdote with there's a guy I know. He's a club promoter, right? He's very, very, very. He sort of was incredibly formative on the gay and LGBTQ plus club scene, and you know, you have that sort of anchor tattoo thing on your arm, like that sort of stylized tattoo. He's got a brilliant tattoo, which is the exact same sort of anchor, but the scroll under it says educated.
Yeah.
And I would love to know what a badge to someone, if even if you got 3 or 4 A stars this year, do you feel educated?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's interesting of how educated people feel, and whether education is a feeling rather than practicality. If I'm allowed to round off, I would, on a positive note, there is to focus a little bit on why so many people want to migrate to the UK. There's obviously, you know, much as we're, and I'm included in this, much as we're talking the UK down, there are an awful lot of people who risk their lives and lots of money to smugglers and, you know, all the rest of it, scams, etc., to come here. And they would...
And Rishi Sunak's 3-word generative expressions, you know.
Yeah. And obviously, you know, the risks are, once you can actually get on a boat and you can be rescued by somebody, RNLI or whoever, the chances are these people just disappear into the undergrowth. You know, we put them into migrant hotels. And tomorrow we do a roll call and oops, you know, 10% are missing or 20% are missing. Oh, where did they go? Well, let's not chase after them. So from a migrant's point of view, once you're here, it's your home and dry, so to speak, you know, in all senses of the word. But the underlying question is still, why is the UK a country of choice?
That's brilliant, and I'll answer that very, very quickly, succinctly, but we'll go into it on the next version thereof. This is going to have to be a 2-parter. Sorry, it's going to have to be that way. So the next one will be the 3rd part when we do it at some stage. So, because I'm going to have to split this into 2 parts, because otherwise it's way too long. But the reality of the situation is, so for those who are listening to part 2 of this later on, the reality of the situation is that empire has a lot to do with it, because Britain had 1/3 of the world's population and 1/3 of the world's landmass under its control at one stage, and because of that there was a unity. Most people do not know there was no such thing as British nationality until the Nationalities Act in the 1960s. Right? Yeah. It was imperial nationality. You were a subject of the empire. So this whole nonsense they're talking about now, the Windrush, right, coming through as immigrants coming through. No, they weren't immigrants. They were members of the empire moving to another part of the empire, as everybody who was a member of the empire had a right to do. Right. So this is something that needs to be understood. And by the way, they were there way before that in the Second World War, blah, blah, 2,000 years ago. But that's something we can talk about later on. But the point is that Britain has that going for it. Now, the other side of that coin is, because I did some stuff on this, people smuggling, etc., when I was in the job. They don't only come to Britain. The fact is they do come to Greece, and they come to Spain, and they come to Cyprus, or wherever they can get the boat to come to. And to France and obviously to Germany, because it's wealthy. But the big thing that Britain's got going for it, other than for the French colonial possessions, where they have a lot of people as well, and they weren't colonies in France, they were parts of France, which is the other side to that, is that they speak English. And, yes. And that is one of the greatest things going for this country. But, you know...
Well, for better or for worse, it's like, you know, what, okay, so hypothetically, why do all these colonialists gravitate towards Britain? Because they speak English, because we forced them to speak English.
Correct. That's it in a nutshell.
Well, that's right. But if you wanted to get into China, learning Chinese is extremely difficult.
Correct.
And you switch on any Hollywood movie and they speak English.
Correct. And it just comes into your brain. Yeah. Even if you're not trying to, it's just seeping in there. Yes. And I used to be a DJ, and folk used to come up to in Germany. Folk used to come up to me and say, "Oh, what does that word actually say? What is he singing here? What is he singing there?" And they are learning.
Yeah.
And sorry, Carlton, I'm just going to wrap, just because my mum will find this funny because she speaks German, but what was the word you used when you should have said Kugelschreiber the other day?
Oh, right, yeah. Well, what I call it was a Vollfederhalter, which is an old-fashioned word and can mean a quill and can mean an old-fashioned word for a fountain pen. But in the modern parlance, they use the word Kuli. Yeah, so that's the modern now. In fact, even more modern now. They probably just say pen because everything's English now these days. It's got crazy in Germany. But Vollfederhalter is obviously the real word, which comes from the quill, and of course the fountain pen.
Indeed so. Yeah.
So I did notice that you're not part of the Strauss family, are you?
No, unfortunately not, or fortunately not. I know, exactly. That's, neither of the Johanns, or there was an Otto and all the rest. Yeah, no.
Eva, thank you very, very much. I'm just going to...
Not at all. Good chatting to you.
Likewise. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. And thank you to our guest, Eva. And hopefully you will hear from Fergus and I again next week.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
In the quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.